Hello, and welcome to our journey throughout 18th century industrial Britain. We would like to talk to you today about lives and rights of workers, the economic struggles they went through, and the impact of the children and women in the factories and the home. Welcome. Throughout the time of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the conditions in which workers were expected to work and thrive in challenged their natural rights as human beings. In many cases, people were treated like animals and expected to work as machines. Primary sources from this time reveal the sickening truths of the daily life of working man, woman, and child, as real-life experiences are depicted in dialogue and explicit images. Areas in question are child labor, hidden sexual assault, inconsistency from the rights given by the state and their absence in the workplace, health concerns, the decrease of success in familial aspect, and the rights non-existent for working women. Essentially, factory work greatly affected the life experiences of children, men, and women. This time in Britain is the reason for very distinct separation of work and home. Before the change, work such as farming, trades, and cottage industries, work and home were not certainly separate circles. The Industrial Revolution radically changed the organization of work, and the consequences were a menacing reality to those who were paid victims of the system. And now we welcome economist Haley Robinson to talk about the economic factors during the Industrial Revolution.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here. Before I start talking about the economics of the time, it is important that we first understand a key term, real wages. Real wages are wages adjusted for inflation, or in other words, we use real wages as a measure because we can get a relative look at how much people made in terms of the cost of living. There has been much debate over the years as to whether or not the Industrial Revolution was a time of prosperity for workers or a time of low wages and poor working conditions. I myself am a big believer in comparative economics. If we look at the real wages in England, specifically in London, compared to the rest of Europe, we see some interesting trends. In figure 1 here, if we look at the highlighted period between 1700 and 1850, we can see that London had the highest real wages relative to other European cities at around 11 or 12. England was a powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution, with the largest urban economy in Europe, and this was reflected in the real wages of the time period. Real wages in the case of the Industrial Revolution are a factor of urbanization, agricultural productivity, and land/labor. We can model this using the function you see on the screen. We can validate these high wages by looking at the factors that contribute to its growth, specifically urbanization. As you can see in this table, England has a huge growth in urban population between 1500 and 1800, from 7% to 29%. This increase in urbanization increases real wages as directly noted by the formula. As urbanization increases, so do real wages. Some of the criticisms this analysis gets are pertaining to women and children and their wages during the Industrial Revolution. We can look at some of the facts and figures about their wages in England compared to the wages of the women in France. In the pre-industrial economy, spinning was one of the most common jobs for women. Spinners in England could earn real wages that were a third greater than women in France. Women in England could earn $6.2 per day, while women in France could earn 9 tournois. Let us look at Table 3. We can see a summary of real wage earnings of all classes of British workers. We can see that women's real wages in England were 3.58, while women in France only had real wages of 2.40. This shows us that British workers earn 40 to 45% more than their counterparts in France. All of this data tells us that women and children participated in a high-wage economy just like men did in England. Although it can also be noted that even though women earned high wages relative to those in France, they still only earned half the real wages that men did in England.
Thank you, Haley, for talking to us about the economics of this time. And now we're going to transition to the working and living conditions of the Industrial Revolution. The lives and rights of the working class have changed dramatically as Europe has developed, and the relationship between workers' rights and freedoms and the happiness they find in their lives has evolved and unfolded into a very complex system. Workers have been impacted by economic development, revolution, an increase in ideas of liberty and freedom, and the literary culture surrounding them. Britain has played a huge part in the development of the role of the worker and has changed the way people look at the working class due to the impact of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was responsible for atrocious living and working conditions, extensive health issues for people in the working class, and life outside of work was drastically changed. The textile industry took off greatly during the start of industrialization, and obtaining a factory job became a common situation in the poor and working class. There were a vast number of factory jobs, and people working in the factories required little skill or knowledge and education. Wages were extremely low for these jobs because the workers were so easily replaceable and people were desperate for work. Jobs that required the farming or manufacturing skills of these people were often replaced by machines, so people were left with these mindless jobs of operating the factory machines. Factory employers could continuously lower their wages because people were so frantic and desperate for work. Working conditions, to put plainly, were outrageously poor. The majority of workers worked for 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days of the week, with only short breaks for meals. Most of the machinery in factories were dangerous and would produce smoke in the dimly lit rooms. The moving parts of the machine were very unsafe, and one could easily lose a limb if caught in the machine. The machines did not slow down if a worker became tired, which was a serious issue. The factories were extremely hot, and workers became exhausted and sluggish from working so many hours at a time, which could lead to mistakes and injuries. Working conditions eventually became so bad and health was such a huge concern that labor unions began to form. It was a struggle to rebel against factory employers and demand better working conditions because workers were so easily let go in exchange for a new worker because people were desperate for money. There was no deficit of workers, so labor unions were not very successful because the jobs required no unique skill that labor unions could withhold from their employers. Living conditions in the poor and working class were another issue that were extremely evident in workers' lives. People would leave their job at the factory and come home to conditions that were just as horrific in different ways. People who were successful and were part of the middle and upper class actually had an improvement in their standard of living at the time of the Industrial Revolution. The middle class emerged during this time and became very successful due to this movement of advancements. Workers who had tangible and unique skills were able to greatly improve their lives outside of work because their particular skill made them more desirable and valuable in the workforce. Those who could take advantage of the better jobs or professions, or those who were lucky enough to be business owners, were able to enjoy comfort, privilege, and leisure in many ways. Those who were uneducated and limited to unskilled labor often remained stuck at the bottom of the economic pile. Those in the poor and working class experienced the opposite effect of those in the upper and middle class, who began encountering the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. People began to flock to urbanized cities to find jobs in the factory, and this quickly led to overpopulation. Slums were a common living situation for most workers during the Industrial Revolution. Poor people who worked in factories would move into big buildings, and there would be about 5 to 10 people living in a single room. Disease ran rampant through the slums because everyone was living in such close quarters. It was much safer to live on rural farms outside the city than be exposed to the dangers of living conditions in the city. Rural life was naturally better than town life. It is also, among other things, why the laborers of Wiltshire, hardly a pampered group, had on average something like twice the life expectancy at birth than laborers of Manchester and Liverpool. Slums in the city were covered in trash and human waste and often were infested with rats. There was no indoor plumbing in the slums, so people would throw their waste into the streets, causing disease epidemics. Crime rates shot up in these areas because people were living so close together and it became easy to steal. The slums were located near the factories, so people worked in the pollution that the factories were constantly contaminating the air near the working class's homes. People in poverty at this time were very uneducated about sanitation and how to properly clean and care for themselves. Disease spread extremely quickly throughout the slums, and cholera was a huge fear. Industrial Britain was hit by an outbreak of cholera in 1831 to 1832, as well as from 1848 to 1849. The cause was simple. Sewage was being allowed to come into contact with drinking water, and it was contaminating it. Since people had nowhere to put their sewage waste, it was contaminating the water people drank, and disease outbreaks were extremely common. People in the lower working class were unable to afford any kind of medical health care or prevention against these diseases. In London, it was thought that 7,000 people died of the disease in the 31 to 32 outbreak, which represented a 50% death rate of those who caught it. People in the lower class were not educated on how to help slow the spread of disease, and there wasn't much they could do because they could not afford to move out of the slums.
Now we welcome a guest to tell us about the personal experiences of her great-great-grandma during the Industrial Revolution.
Hello, my name is Penny Longbottom and I am here today to talk to you about my great-great-grandmother who was alive during the time of the Industrial Revolution. I heard a lot of stories about her as a young girl from my grandma, and she told me about her time as a worker in the factories during this horrible time in her life. She had very low wages and worked in terrible conditions all day. She would tell me about how she would work in the factories for 12 hours straight and then have to go home and take care of the home and cook for the children who were also working in the factories at this time. At the end of the day, my great-great-grandmother would come home covered in filth, and she would tell my grandmother stories about the machines in the factories and how dangerous they were. The machines never stopped, so even if someone was injured, they would continue to move, which was very dangerous to everyone in the factories working. The conditions were terrible, as well as the living conditions that they lived in during this time. The streets were covered in filth, and there was no sewage system in Britain.
Thank you, Penny, so much for sharing your story with us.
The lower class of this time was pushed into heinous working and living conditions, which directly impacted people's health and all-around well-being. For women in particular, this industrial age was extremely detrimental. Because they were in factory all day, they were deprived of the normal life. The Industrial Revolution caused women to be rejected, treated like animals, and have little to no rights. There are wide ranges of jobs for men and women, from armed forces to working in textile mills. Women were discriminated against because their gender. They were unheard of. It was unheard of for a woman to work in the armed forces around this time. In the 1851 census for occupational distribution was taken in Great Britain. In this census, the least amount of women were working in armed forces, fishing, commercial, and construction. As you can see, these may be considered the more manly jobs of that time. In contrast, there were hundreds of workers in domestic services, textiles, clothing, and agriculture. The numbers of women working in these trades grew exponentially because the managers could hire them for such low pay, and they could afford more workers. Along with working in discriminatory jobs, the hours that were required of them were extreme. In some factories, 12 or 13-hour days were normal, and in some cases it was more. One woman in the mining business said, "We leave the house before 6 each morning and are in the level until 7 o'clock, and sometimes later. The average day is to leave home before sunup and get back after sundown." These women were desperate for a job and money, but were also in a hopeless environment wishing for attention. One seamstress named Jenny Jones sang a song called Distress Seamstress. She said, "Concerning the seamstress I'm going to mention, who a long time has been in a sad, wretched state, laboriously toiling, both night, noon, and morning, for a wretched subsistence. Now mark what I say. This is a song of despair, highlighting how horrible this life was. She is begging for help and attention." While women were working for at least 13 hours a day, their families didn't disappear. She also had responsibilities at home. Cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, and taking care of their children was time-consuming. Some mothers were considered negligent because they were working such long hours. Women had to choose between working to provide money or sit at home with their family. For working women, pregnancy is where the trouble started. Long hours, combined with bad conditions, were hard, especially in days leading up to birth. A lot of babies were born on the factory floor, and they were lucky if they were still alive. Their mothers would return to work days after labor, which isn't good for the mother or the baby. This transition may make the mother look neglectful, but there were not many options. Unfortunately, the burden of having a child while working in a factory was too much to handle for some mothers, so they committed infanticide, or killing their babies. For those who didn't do this, they used other means to take care of their children. Some hid from factory inspectors to take care of their children. Others fed their babies through holes in the factory walls. Ultimately, most mothers were neither neglectful nor negligent, but they were just learning how to cope with being mothers and working in harsh hours and conditions of the factories. Like in factories, working in the mines was a very physically demanding job for women. Women had various jobs that required them to haul or move coal from one place to another. Many of these hours, like those in the factories, were for at least 12 hours. By the end of the day, these women were sore, dirty, and tired. Some men even took advantage of them when they were alone. This type of work aged women faster than they should have. Now let's hear a story about their experience. This is a letter from my great-great-grandmother of her life in the factory. I have wrought in the bowels of the earth for 33 years. I have been married 23 years and had 9 children. 6 are alive, 3 died of typhus a few years since. I've had 2 dead-born. Horsework ruins a woman. It crushes their haunches, bends their ankles, and makes them old women at 40. No woman or child deserved to be treated like this. Sickness, disease, and injury were unfortunately a part of this job, and it took a very long time for women to stand up for themselves and demand their rights. The Industrial Revolution was a time of great hardship, but also change for women. They transformed from being almost dehumanized to starting to regain their strength. Children also had to face the same hardship that women did during this time.
When the Industrial Revolution first started out in Great Britain, many families moved from rural cities to the newly industrialized areas due to high demand for labor. Although the Industrial Revolution seemed promising to those in poverty, it ended up not being as bright. To survive in the lowest level of poverty, families had to have every member of the family go to work, which led to an increase in child labor. George Gould, a Manchester merchant, wrote in 1816, "Two children I got to know got employment in a factory when they were 5 years old. The spinning men or women employ children if they can get a child to do their business. The child is paid 1 shilling or 1 shilling and 6 pence, and they would take that 5-year-old child before they take an older one who would cost more." Many children were overworked and underpaid. Children as young as 6 had to work little to no pay. England had more than 1 million child workers, and working conditions during the Industrial Revolution were very extreme. Sometimes children had to work up to 19 hours a day with no breaks. Not only were these children subjected to long hours, but they also had to work in conditions that were not suitable for any workers. William Blake called these places of work the dark satanic mills, and E.P. Thompson described these places as the place of sexual license, foul language, cruelty, violent accidents, and alien matters. As the first textile mills were built, children were subjected to work as primary workers. They worked in factory environments that were dark, and the only light source was from natural lights from the few windows that the factories had. Most of the factories were crowded due to the fact that the machines were close together and there were a lot of workers. Many children were employed due to their ability and to move in between dangerous machines because they were small enough. Charles Aberdeen, who worked in a Manchester cotton factory, said the smallest child in these factories were scavengers. They go under the machine while it is going. It is very dangerous when they first come, but they can become used to it. This increased mortality rates in the factories because it placed children in great danger. Lung disease also led to mortality rates, primarily due to the fact that most of the mills and factories the children worked in were dirty and dusty. Because child labor had become too extreme, many people advocated the abolishment of child labor and the improvement of the factory conditions. In 1833, the Factory Act was passed by Parliament. This act banned children under 9 from working and limited 10 to 13-year-olds to work 48 hours a week. In 1847, the Factory Act limited children to work a maximum of 10 hours per day, and the Factory Act of 1850 prohibited children from working before 6 a.m. and after 6 p.m.
Late 18th and early 19th century Britain underwent major changes in close to all aspects of life due to the Industrial Revolution. Europe as a whole experienced major changes due to scientific advancements that allowed for technological improvements. The Industrial Revolution was the first starting point for learning in Europe, and especially Britain, being that it was the epicenter of change during that time. Trial and error is a part of human nature, and it is almost unavoidable. Unfortunately, this was a very true reality for the people involved in the creation of early modern Britain. The workers of the time were usually taken advantage of their apparent lack of skill and the abundance of workers available for the same job. This created a work environment especially negative for women who would be treated unfairly in the workplace and would receive less pay for the work that they did. Prompted by the oppression that many in the working class felt, literary works were put out to inspire the workers to take back their freedoms. Over the course of the Industrial Revolution, the workers saw vast change, which ultimately led to the economic times we have now that are improved from the days of the past.
Thank you for coming with us on our journey through the Industrial Revolution in Britain. We hope you enjoyed your time. See you next time.
question?
I want to
Can you do
power
a
off.
French accent?
Oh, it's going. Just go.
You need to give me a signal. About the economic impact during the Industrial Revolution, we first needed to find a few, damn it.
Oh, this is a test. Many children were, okay, let me see. No.
Life was endangered throughout her day. Just had to throw their sewage out into the streets. It's a lot of Oh. Touch my mouth.